My name is Margaret Whitfield. I'm 67 years old, and for almost 50 of those years, I lived and worked on the same piece of land with my husband, Richard. Maple Hollow isn't much to look at from the highway, but if you take the gravel road past the old mill and keep going until the trees start thinning out, you'll find our orchard nestled right where the light hits best. We never needed much. Our days were full, not with noise or errands, but with tasks that rooted us. Mornings began before the sun cracked the sky, with me in the kitchen kneading sourdough while Richard walked the rows, inspecting the branches like they were children who'd grown overnight. There was a kind of rhythm to our life that made sense, the same way you know when an apple is ready to pick just by the way it tilts in your hand. We had our routines, but they never felt dull. Every evening ended with the same cups of coffee, the same stories we'd told each other 100 times, and still found funny. Richard could read the weather by the way the wind moved across the grass. I could bake by feel, not measurement, between us. We kept the orchard going through droughts, floods, even a tornado that took out the west fence line one spring, but somehow spared the beehives. We weren't rich, but we were whole. The land gave back what we gave to it. We raised our 2 kids here, taught them to pick apples, respect the soil, and help with chores before they were tall enough to see over the counter. And even though they grew up and moved far away, I always believed they carried this place in their bones the way I did. Richard passed away last winter. Pancreatic cancer. It took him slow and steady, like the frost that creeps in when you forget to bring in the potted herbs. 15 months of hospital drives, whispered updates, and pretending things were still normal when they weren't. He didn't want the kids to know. Said they had their own lives and didn't need to carry our grief too. I understood, though it broke my heart a little. I think he wanted to protect them from watching him disappear piece by piece. After he died, the house got very quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't just come from someone being gone, but from the absence of being seen, of being heard. I tried to keep busy, cleaned out the pantry, reorganized the seed cabinet, baked bread I didn't have anyone to feed. People in town were kind. They brought casseroles, sent cards, even left flowers on the porch without signing their names. But kindness can only fill a person so much. Eventually, you're left with your own breath and the echo of footsteps that aren't coming back. I thought grief would be the hardest part. I didn't realize that what would hurt more was what came after, not the funeral or the quiet bed, or the way the orchard seemed to stand still. It was the feeling that maybe the life Richard and I had built together wasn't enough to keep everything else from slipping through my fingers. I hadn't spoken to Daniel or Haley much in the months leading up to Richard's passing. A few texts, a call on holidays. They said work was busy, or flights were expensive, or the kids had soccer tournaments. I told myself it was normal. Grown kids drift, life pulls in different directions. Still, I believed they'd come back when it mattered, that they'd understand the orchard wasn't just dirt and trees, but the beating heart of our family, that they'd step into the quiet, not to change it, but to honor it. The day after Richard's funeral, I made a pot of coffee, not the imported kind Daniel liked, just plain drip like Richard always drank it. I stood at the window watching the trees sway in the wind, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure what came next. The orchard was still standing. The apples were still growing, but something inside me had shifted, and though I didn't know it then, the real storm hadn't even begun. It wasn't cancer or death that would unravel everything. It was something more familiar, closer to home. And as I stood there holding that cup in both hands, feeling the warmth sink into my skin, I realized I might not be grieving alone. I might be standing at the edge of a very different kind of loss, one I hadn't seen coming. Daniel arrived first. His rental car was so clean it didn't look like it had ever touched gravel. And the way he stepped out of it, with his crisp blazer and city shoes, I could already tell he hadn't dressed for the orchard. He hugged me the way you hug a colleague at a networking event, polite, brief, practiced. Haley came a few hours later, rolling a suitcase across the porch like she was checking into a hotel. Her hair was curled just right, her blouse a soft silk that caught the sunlight. She barely glanced around the house before asking if the Wi-Fi still worked. I made them coffee, Same kind I always made. Haley took one sip and asked if I had almond milk. Daniel didn't even drink his. Just set it down on the counter like it was part of some stage set. We sat in the kitchen, and I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway louder than any of our voices. They didn't ask how I was holding up, didn't ask about the funeral arrangements or how long I had been sleeping on the couch because I couldn't bear to climb into that empty bed. They asked about the account access, the orchard finances, and what I planned to do next. I watched Daniel pull out his tablet and start tapping, like he was preparing a meeting agenda. Haley crossed her legs, looked at me with this soft, practiced smile, and said maybe it was time we had a real conversation. I said nothing, just refilled my own mug with lukewarm coffee. They didn't notice how out of place they looked here. The mud on their shoes wasn't from working the land. The jackets they wore weren't for wind or chill, just image. They sat at the table where Richard used to read seed catalogs and I rolled out pie crusts, and all I could think was how far away they felt. That night, after they went to bed, I stayed downstairs and stared at the photos on the mantel. There was one of Daniel with his first prize pumpkin, missing his 2 front teeth, and Haley beside him with a juice box and dirt on her chin. I don't know when those kids turned into these adults, but I felt like I had been left behind in my own life. The next morning, I offered to make breakfast. Daniel said he'd brought protein bars. Haley was already on a video call. I laid out bread, jam, and butter like I always had, even though I knew they wouldn't touch it. Then Daniel cleared his throat. He said he and Haley had been talking, and maybe it was time to settle things. Settle. Like grief was a line item to close out before end of quarter. Haley added something about wanting what was best for me. A nice community, a smaller place, friends my age. I said nothing at first, not because I agreed, but because I wasn't sure I was hearing them right. My husband hadn't been in the ground a full week, and here they were, talking about dividing what he left behind as if it were stock options. Something shifted in me then. Not loud or dramatic, just a slow cooling, like a pie taken out of the oven too soon. I looked at them, my own children, and for the first time I felt like a guest in my own family. Daniel reached into his briefcase like he was closing a deal. He slid a folder across the kitchen table, slow and deliberate, as if he'd been rehearsing the moment. Inside was a will, neatly typed, printed on his company letterhead, with Richard's signature at the bottom in ink that looked too fresh. I stared at the page, my fingers still resting on the ceramic coffee mug. The signature stopped me cold. It was too smooth, too even. Richard hadn't written like that in months. His hand had trembled too much, especially near the end when even holding a spoon wore him out. Daniel said they'd discussed it last year, that Richard wanted him and Melissa to take over the orchard, turn it into something bigger. He used words like transition and vision, like this was a business proposal and not the life Richard and I built together from bare soil and stubborn hope. I asked where the family lawyer was in all this. Daniel didn't blink, said it was faster this way. Haley nodded, chiming in about how hard these conversations were, and how they just wanted what was best for everyone. But I knew Richard. I knew how he cradled that orchard like a living thing. He wouldn't have handed it off with a typed memo. He would have sat me down, folded his hands, and told me himself. He wouldn't have hidden something that sacred in a manila folder with bullet points. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. But something inside me began to lean back, not away in fear, but back into myself, into the part of me that had been here all along, pruning trees in frost and baking bread at dawn, while they were off forgetting where they came from. I told them I'd look at it later, said I needed rest, but I knew, as sure as I knew the smell of a ripe apple, that this wasn't Richard's doing, not fully, not cleanly. And I felt the first threads of resistance settle into my chest, quiet and sure. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to let it slide. I came downstairs to find them waiting, coats on, coffee mugs in hand, and a suitcase by the door that I hadn't packed. Daniel smiled in that tight way people do when they're about to say something unpleasant but want it to sound helpful. Haley was scrolling through something on her phone, her voice light, almost chipper, like we were heading off on a vacation. They said it might be nice to drive down to Sunny Pines, just to look, a retirement community 2 hours south, all-inclusive, peaceful, with activities and people my age. I looked at the suitcase. It wasn't even mine, just clothes they had picked out, folded by someone who didn't know which sweater I wore when I missed Richard most. I hadn't even had time to go through his things. And here they were, packing mine. They kept their voices cheerful, like this was love disguised as logistics. Daniel said I deserved comfort. Haley nodded, her tone smooth, practiced, reassuring in a way that didn't feel real. They called it a transition, a new chapter, said the house was too much, the orchard too much, life itself too much for someone my age. I moved past them to pour a cup of coffee, pretending my hands weren't shaking. The room felt too bright. The kitchen smelled like lemon cleaner and change. Not a trace of morning in the air, only plans being pushed forward. Daniel reached for the suitcase. Haley offered to take my arm. There was a moment where I could have said yes, could have made it easier for everyone. Instead, I told them I needed my medication, maybe a few family photos. Haley smiled like I was being cooperative. Daniel glanced at his watch, already thinking about the next step. I climbed the stairs slowly, my legs aching more from disbelief than from age. I stood in the hallway outside my bedroom, listening to their footsteps downstairs. They didn't sound like family anymore. They sounded like people wrapping up a task. That suitcase was supposed to be kindness, but it was a cage with wheels. And I knew, standing there, that whatever came next, I would not go quietly. The road they took wasn't familiar. Gravel popped under the tires, dust trailing behind us like smoke from something already burned. I didn't ask where we were going. I already knew the answer, just not the shape of it. When the car slowed and rolled to a stop beside an open field, Daniel didn't even look at me. He just put it in park, stepped out, and opened my door like he was dropping off a donation. Haley followed, holding the suitcase like a peace offering, her eyes avoiding mine. Daniel said this was where I got off. He said it so casually, like we were on a bus route and I'd reached my destination. Haley muttered something about a gas station up the road, said it wasn't far, that someone could help me there. They didn't wait to see if I responded. The car door clicked shut, and just like that, they drove away. I stood still, wind tugging at the hem of my coat, gravel crunching under my shoes as I adjusted my stance. I didn't cry. I didn't shout after them. I just stood there, the silence folding in on me, more honest than anything I had heard from them in days. The suitcase felt heavier than it should. I knew what they thought, that I'd walk to the gas station, call someone, and vanish into some soft place where they didn't have to look at me anymore. But I wasn't lost. I wasn't weak. I was awake. I turned, not toward the road they pointed me to, but toward the direction I remembered. Back to town. Back to people who called me by name. My shoes weren't meant for walking, but I walked anyway. Each step scraped away what had been weighing me down. I thought about Richard's laugh, the way he used to rub the back of his neck when he was thinking. I thought about how hard we worked, how much we gave, and how fast our children had tried to erase all of it. I didn't have a plan, but I had something stronger. I had the truth. And now, for the first time, I was ready to carry it. Harold's office still smelled like old books and lemon oil. The same lace curtains fluttered by the window, and the chair I sat in creaked just like it had 20 years ago. He looked older, a little more bent, but his eyes sharpened when I placed the fireproof box between us. I opened it without ceremony. Inside was the original deed, yellowed at the edges, with my maiden name printed in bold. 20 acres of orchard land, tucked behind the main grove, never touched by the business transfer paperwork. Harold picked it up like it was glass. His brow furrowed, then lifted. He traced the lines of the document, and I watched the shift happen behind his glasses. I didn't have to explain what it meant. He saw it instantly. He leaned back, thoughtful. Those 20 acres held the only spring-fed water source on the property. Without those rights, no development could happen. No irrigation meant no orchard, and no orchard meant no sale. He looked at me, not with pity, but with something close to pride. He asked if anyone else knew. I shook my head. Richard and I had bought it before we married, a backup plan we never needed, until now. We sat quietly for a while. He ran his fingers along the edge of the desk, then nodded to himself. We would file an injunction, freeze the deal before it went any further. Let the developer know the land was incomplete and the water rights weren't theirs to claim. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it was certain. Harold said it was a solid case, especially if Richard's signature on the other will was as suspicious as it looked. He would check the original files, call the judge himself if he had to. I didn't ask for revenge. I just wanted the truth to breathe again. For the orchard to stand, not as a battleground, but as a home. I wanted Daniel and Haley to understand what they had done, even if they never said it out loud. Harold folded the deed carefully and slid it into a protective sleeve. He said we'd move fast, and we'd stay quiet until the time was right. I thanked him, not with words, but with the steadiness in my voice. That night, as I walked back through town with the copy in my bag, I felt the weight of everything shift. They had tried to erase me, but they forgot who held the roots. By noon the next day, Harold had filed the emergency motion. The courthouse clerk stamped the paperwork without asking questions, and a courier delivered the injunction letter to the developer's office that same afternoon. It was clean, direct, and final. The reaction came quickly. The developer's legal team sent a flurry of emails to Harold's office, requesting clarification, additional documents, anything to undo the freeze. But Harold didn't rush. He answered every inquiry with calm, measured precision. They hadn't done their homework. No one had checked the full land registry. They assumed the orchard was a single parcel, never guessing that the water rights were held separately. That one mistake turned their deal into a puzzle with a missing piece. I sat across from Harold while he returned one of their calls. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stated that without my consent, no legal transfer could proceed, that the land was not as represented. That evening, I checked the prepaid phone I'd bought from Ray's shop. There were 3 missed calls from Daniel, 1 from Haley. A text message followed. Just 4 words. "Mom, please call me." I didn't answer. A few hours later, another came. "Darren's freaking out. We didn't know. Let's fix this." Not an apology, just panic. Not a word about what they had done. Only concern that the deal might slip through their fingers. Harold and I reviewed the forged will again. The signature didn't match Richard's in his final weeks. The lines were steady, smooth, too perfect. The court would see that, in time. But it wasn't just about the paper. It was about what they tried to take and how they did it. Not with grief or memory or reverence, but with a signature slipped between folders and a suitcase packed behind my back. Outside Harold's office, Maple Hollow moved on like always. Kids rode their bikes. Dogs barked in yards. Somewhere, someone was baking bread. The world didn't know what happened, and I didn't need it to. Victory didn't come with shouting. It came with the quiet knowledge that I had stopped them, that the land would remain whole, that Richard's legacy wasn't for sale. I didn't gloat. I didn't respond. I let the silence speak for me, and for once, it said everything I needed. The first message came late. Haley's name lit up my phone, the same phone I hadn't used since the courthouse filing. Her words were short, rushed, full of worry. "Mom, please call me." I stared at the screen without moving. It had been weeks since either of them spoke to me like a person. Now that the ground was slipping beneath them, they remembered I existed. An hour later, another message. "Darren's freaking out. We didn't know about the other land. Can we fix this?" I read it twice. Not a single word of regret, just fear, and maybe a little disbelief that I had done something they hadn't predicted. Harold told me Daniel had called his office, tried to sound composed, but his voice cracked when Harold explained the injunction wasn't going away. He asked who owned the water rights. Harold said Margaret does. She always did. They were scrambling. That's what happens when power shifts quietly. They never thought I'd stand up. Not without yelling, not without slamming doors. But I didn't need noise. I needed truth. And I had that from the start. I didn't respond to Haley. I didn't send a message back. There was nothing left to say that they could understand in words. They thought strength was control. The kind that wears a suit and talks fast. The kind that signs papers and moves on. But I learned something different. Out there on the orchard, year after year. Strength was in getting up before sunrise to water trees through frost, in baking bread by hand, in staying kind even when you were hurting, in knowing when silence says more than anger ever could. They hadn't seen that part of me, or maybe they had, and decided it wasn't worth much. But now they knew. Now they had to face the version of me that didn't need their permission to fight. I wasn't angry anymore, just clear. They couldn't fix this with a phone call. They couldn't erase what they'd done with a few frantic texts. Sometimes, the only answer left is silence, and that silence was finally mine to choose. The apartment above the bakery was small, but it suited me. Each morning, the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread rose up through the floorboards like a kind of welcome. I'd sit on the little balcony with a cup of tea, wrapped in my old cardigan, watching the town wake up. I found a second-hand rocking chair at the thrift store. It creaked in a familiar way when I leaned back, and I liked the way the morning sun landed across my lap. From up there, I could see the library, the corner where the kids waited for the school bus, and the sign for Miller's Grocery. No one looked at me like a stranger. People waved. The woman who ran the flower shop brought me a bouquet of peonies one afternoon, just because she had extras. I started walking to the community center on Wednesdays, teaching quilting classes like I used to. It felt good to be useful again, not in a way that drained me, but in a way that reminded me who I had always been. The town didn't ask for explanations. It just folded me back in like I had never left. I planted herbs in little pots for the balcony, basil, thyme, and a stubborn lavender that refused to bloom but still smelled wonderful. On weekends, I held gardening workshops at the library. Teenagers showed up, young couples with dirt still under their nails. They asked questions, took notes, stayed late. I didn't talk much about the orchard, but when I did, I spoke with my hands. About soil, about patience, about what it meant to care for something you may never fully own. They listened, not because I raised my voice, but because I meant every word. Some nights, I sat alone and missed Richard. That part hadn't changed, but the ache was quieter now, like the way a scar fades, still there but no longer raw. I didn't have the farmhouse. I didn't have the long fields outside my window, but I had peace, and for the first time in a long while, I had chosen it myself. The deed sat on my kitchen table for a week before I decided what to do with it. I would pass it on, but not to those who saw the land as profit. I donated the water rights to the Hazel Ridge Agricultural Cooperative, a group of young farmers trying to make something real in a world moving too fast. They were grateful, but they didn't know the full weight of the gift. That land held my past, but now it could hold their future. I didn't need to own it anymore to love it. The cooperative came out to tour the orchard. They walked the rows with quiet respect, asking about soil pH and late frosts. I answered gently, showing them where the ground pooled after heavy rain, where the bees liked to rest. I started teaching on Saturdays, just a few chairs in the back of the library, some note cards, and a folder full of memories. We talked about grafting, compost, what patience looked like in fruit form. There was a boy named Leo who asked too many questions, and a girl named Rachel, who took notes like she was collecting something sacred. They reminded me of Richard when he was young, always wondering, always hoping. One evening, I walked past the edge of the orchard. The trees had begun to bloom again. I stood at the fence line, the wind soft with spring, and felt the rhythm of it still beating, even without me there. I didn't need to reclaim the house or fight for title. I had already won. Legacy isn't about control. It's about what you leave behind and who you trust to carry it forward. I gave the land not because I wanted to let go, but because I finally could. And in doing so, I found something steadier than ownership. I found peace in knowing the orchard would live on, not just in trees, but in the hands that would tend them next. The messages still come sometimes, short ones, like little pebbles tossed at a window. Daniel asking if we can talk, Haley mentioning she'll be in town next month. I read them, but I don't respond. It isn't anger that keeps me quiet, it's peace. The kind that comes after a storm, when the sky clears and you realize you survived something you didn't know you could. They didn't understand back then. Maybe they still don't. That love isn't a license to take, and being a mother doesn't mean losing yourself. I used to think silence was weakness, that if I didn't speak up, I wasn't strong. But I've learned there's power in choosing when not to answer. Not every knock deserves opening the door. What they did wasn't just a mistake, it was a choice. And now, so is mine. I chose not to let them rewrite what I spent a lifetime building. I still love them. That part doesn't go away. But I don't owe them my silence in the face of betrayal, or my presence in the name of peace. Richard once told me that roots grow strongest in hard ground. I think he was right. Because I'm still here, still standing, and for the first time, fully myself. I found my voice. It doesn't yell. It doesn't chase. It simply stays steady, clear, and honest. If they ever come to me not as owners, not as heirs, but as children seeking understanding, I'll be here, but I won't go back to who I was to make them feel comfortable. I've learned that setting boundaries isn't cruelty. It's clarity. And in that clarity, I finally found room to breathe. To anyone listening, I want to tell you this. Your strength isn't in how loud you speak or how hard you fight. It's in knowing who you are when no one's watching and choosing to stand for yourself anyway. For a long time, I thought being quiet meant being small. That if I didn't push back, people wouldn't hear me. But silence can be steady, and sometimes it echoes longer than shouting ever could. You don't have to prove your worth to those who forget it. You don't have to stay soft just to be loved. The people who see you clearly won't ask you to shrink. I didn't reclaim my home with rage. I reclaimed it by remembering my name, by holding on to the truth I already carried. If you've ever been cast aside or told your story didn't matter, let this be your reminder. You are not what they failed to see. You are what you continue to become. I didn't need a courtroom speech or a dramatic ending. I needed a moment of stillness, a place to stand, a reason to begin again. So wherever you are, whatever road you've been left on, know this. You are not done, not forgotten, not powerless. Your voice is enough, even when it's quiet, especially when it's quiet. And when the time comes to tell your story, do it in your own way. Someone out there needs to hear it. Maybe they'll find themselves in your words, like you found yourself in mine. My name is Margaret. I was underestimated, but I remembered who I was. And now, I walk in peace.